All right, we're about to break down the machinery of modern conflict. But we're not going to be looking at tanks or missiles. Not really. We're going to explore a force that's way, way more powerful. Something that exists where hard power and human belief collide. And it all kicks off with this question right here. We usually think about war in terms of economics and military strength. And, of course, that stuff matters. But what if the real drivers, the things that actually get the wheels turning, are the powerful stories we tell ourselves? Stories about who we are, where we're going, and what we should be afraid of. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to investigate that machinery. We're going to look at 5 interconnected forces that are all grinding against each other right now, turning what should be simple friction into global conflict. Think of it like a conflict machine with 5 distinct interlocking gears. We're going to take it apart piece by piece. Okay, let's start with the first gear in our machine. This one's all about a massive shift in global power. Basically, there's a huge and growing gap between how leaders are behaving and the world as it actually is today. See, for decades after the Cold War, there was this feeling of a unipolar moment, where it seemed like one superpower was basically setting all the rules. But that era is over. We have moved deep into what's called a multipolar world. That just means there are now multiple centers of gravity, several major powers, and all of them feel like they're entitled to make the rules. And when everybody thinks they're in charge, well, you get friction. Everywhere. So this is the core tension right here. So many leaders are stuck in what you might call a unipolar habit. They're still acting like one power can manage the whole globe, but they're operating in a multipolar reality. And that mismatch, that gap between the old habit and the new reality, is exactly where massive miscalculations happen. And this insight is just key. As the historian Yuval Noah Harari points out, that unipolar moment wasn't just about having the biggest army or economy. It was a story, a shared narrative that everyone kind of bought into. But what happens when people stop believing that story? Well, the institutions and the sense of order built on top of it start to get real shaky. So how can you spot this unipolar habit out in the wild? You just have to look for the tells. Like a policy that just assumes you have infinite resources, or when the public reasons for a conflict seem to change every other week. Or maybe leaders draw these big red lines and then do absolutely nothing when they're crossed. These aren't just one-off mistakes. They're symptoms. They're the signs of a power that's failing to adapt to a new game. Okay, let's click the second gear into place and see how this machine really starts to rev up. We're talking about the proxy war trap. This is where big powers try to avoid fighting each other directly, so they compete through other smaller nations instead. They're supposed to be contained, but boy, do they have a nasty habit of escalating. And that escalation tends to follow a really predictable pattern. It's like a ladder. It starts small, just sending a few advisors. But then, oops, those advisors start becoming operators. And pretty soon, those operators are called a limited deployment. And before you know it, that limited deployment is a permanent presence. It's this slow, methodical creep into direct involvement. Which, of course, brings us to the million-dollar question. If nobody actually wants a bigger war, why on earth does this keep happening? The answer, it turns out, is a really dangerous psychological trap. Political scientist Allison just puts it perfectly. The trap is credibility. Each side is thinking, if I don't respond now, I'm going to look weak. So they take one small step up the ladder. Then the other side responds, taking their own small step. No single step feels like a huge deal until you finally look down and realize you're so high up, you can't possibly get back down without a catastrophic fall. And there's another hidden cost. Leaders like to imagine that the pain and suffering of a proxy war will stay over there. But in our world, a world this interconnected, it always comes back. It boomerangs back as energy price spikes, as waves of migration, as political polarization right at home. It's a feedback loop that can make a society even less stable and less able to think clearly. All right, on to our third gear. And this one adds a powerful emotional accelerant to the whole machine. We're talking about sacred geography. These are the handful of places on Earth where normal, rational political logic can just completely break down. Because a sacred site isn't just a piece of land. As the scholar Reza Aslan explains, it's a physical anchor for a group's entire story. It connects their identity, their history, their sense of divine purpose, all to one specific spot on the map. So an attack on the place isn't just a tactical move. It's felt as an attack on their very soul. And this is what creates what you might call an asymmetric stake. One side might be calculating risk in familiar, material terms. Soldiers, money, territory. But the other side?
They're calculating it in spiritual, existential terms. And this kind of imbalance makes normal diplomacy and deterrence incredibly difficult, because the two sides aren't even playing the same game.
Which leads us directly to the fourth, and maybe the most volatile, gear in this whole conflict machine. What happens when apocalyptic stories and prophecy start to drive actual government policy? This is when things get really dangerous.
So you have to see the difference in logic here. Normal ideology, even really intense ideology, almost always allows for some kind of bargaining. The goal is usually to avoid a total catastrophe. But apocalyptic thinking is different. It often sees compromise as a betrayal of faith. It sees history as a pre-written script that's moving toward one final, inevitable climax. So what are the warning signs? First, just listen to the rhetoric. Is the enemy a political rival, or are they cosmic evil? Then, watch the policy. Are leaders refusing obvious off-ramps that could save them? Is any kind of dissent being treated like treason or blasphemy? And critically, notice when material facts, like costs and logistics, are just dismissed as totally irrelevant. When destiny is on the line, who cares about the budget, right? That's when you know reality has pretty much left the building. Finally, let's look at the fifth gear. This is the one that kind of lubricates all the others and lets them spin faster. It's the modern war on reality itself. This thick, dense fog of propaganda, censorship, and now AI-generated media. This quote just captures the shift perfectly. The whole goal of modern information war isn't simply to spread lies. No, it's to make a coherent, shared reality completely impossible to find. And in that fog, people don't look for facts. They cling to whatever story makes them feel righteous and safe. Coherence, feeling like you're part of a tribe, becomes way more important than truth. So how do we, as individuals, navigate this fog? Well, it starts with being deeply suspicious of any story that gives you that instant hit of righteousness. That feeling is often the hook. We have to learn to separate emotional claims from actual evidence. And we should always ask ourselves the most important question. Who benefits from me feeling this way? This furious, this certain, or this afraid? So we've seen how these 5 gears, a multipolar world, proxy traps, sacred tripwires, apocalyptic narratives, and this information fog all feed into each other. They create this really dangerous feedback loop. So the ultimate question is, how do we interrupt it? How do we find an off-ramp? And the answer might be a little counterintuitive. In a world that so often rewards aggression, a world that equates backing down with weakness, maybe the most difficult and courageous act isn't to escalate. Maybe it's to practice restraint. It requires a completely different kind of strength, one that's rooted in humility and a clear-eyed view of the risks. And that leaves us with this final thought. If our world is, in fact, built on stories, and if we know those stories can lead us into catastrophic conflicts, then the most important challenge we all face is figuring out how to consciously and deliberately choose a different one. A story that values restraint over reaction, and maybe a little wisdom over absolute certainty.